I want to thank everyone for attending, because although I do a lot of talks, this is the one that mattered to me the most, because you're my family. So I'm really glad you're all here. And now sit back and you're going to be entertained for the next 40 minutes. And I'm going to sit because I'm getting old.
You're getting?
You're naughty.
Who was that?
Julie, if you hear that, no one's gonna be sorry or.
I'm excited that my newest book in the Deborah and Miriam Boston Marriage series, Victory, Virus, and Votes, which is right here, has been published, is available in the back table in the back of the room and on Amazon.com, and you can get it on ebook. This was a dramatic period in American history, with the Great War, the influenza pandemic of 1918, and the passage of suffrage, finally allowing women the opportunity to vote. Wait. As in all historical fiction, each of the events discussed in the book is linked to experiences of my characters. This is one of the biggest challenges and the most enjoyable aspects of writing in this genre. In the short pieces I will read today, you'll get a taste of the personal connection I had related to each of the tales. You'll get to meet my Grandma Levy, and I have my aunt here. I lost this last year and I found it yesterday just in time. This was my aunt. This is my aunt, so she's come here to join us. Oh, that's good. Okay. More important than the history is my characters. Most of you have met Deborah and Miriam in my prior talks or by reading my books. And this lesbian couple who fell in love in 1910 is central to all my books. They and their chosen family will help you experience history as people of the era dealt with it when it was happening, rather than as facts you read about. Today I'm going to read you some short sections from the book. You're going to learn about some unknown heroines from World War I, gain some insight as to what it was like for young girls who enlisted in the military in this era, and learn the interesting background of bakery products that you will recognize. And if you're lucky and you don't interrupt me too much, you'll get to hear a short reading from my next book. And in all honesty, I have finished the next book.
Wow.
The one after this. I'm on the second edit. Yeah. It's just, I'm obsessed. So I'm going to read to you about Grace Banker, a true heroine of World War I. And after learning about her, I had to figure out how to fit her into my story. So I researched her background, and when I learned that she graduated from Barnard College in 1914, the very same year that two of the characters in my first book, Susan and Helen, graduated from Barnard, I was thrilled. You can imagine the excitement. The coincidence gave me an easy way to work this story into my book. And this hat's going to fall off. You'll soon learn about my fictitious character's friends, the real Grace Banker. As I did more research, I discovered that Grace Banker's granddaughter, Carolyn Timby, was speaking at a World War I centennial conference about her grandmother's role as a hello girl, the name affectionately given to the brave women who provided frontline communication for the army in France during the Great War. I tracked down Carolyn, and I was sitting in my house when I got a call from her, and she taught me lots of details that aren't in any of the books about her grandma. Wow. And when I requested a photograph, because I was having trouble finding a public domain photograph that I could use, she said, hold on a minute, and she went in and took this picture off of her table and copied it and texted it to me. So this isn't in any of the books. This is my personal picture from Carolyn Timby.
Wow. She's so young there.
Oh, hold on. So I followed the adventures of this 25-year-old who took her troops close to the battlegrounds with her to assist in their important communication role. This excerpt is just the beginning of her story, yet my book follows her over several years and through many chapters, because she was around for a while. And as background, before I start reading, Susan and Helen are Deborah and Miriam's friends and housemates and employees. And before I start, I have to tell you about this picture. So they were at Barnard, my girls were, they were around Barnard College, and Susan and Helen were at Barnard. And so I drove with my sister to New York to see all the sites that I needed to make it more real. And we pulled up to this gate at Barnard College. It was in the middle of a 4-lane highway, and I pulled over to the side and said, hold your hat, Nancy, I'm taking this picture. I got out of my car to take a picture of this gate.
Beautiful.
Risked my life for my book. Okay, so now I'll start reading. February 19th, 1919. Susan and Helen came downstairs one evening with a question. Do you remember our friend Grace Banker from Barnard College? Susan asked Deborah and Miriam. Was she the girl who dragged huge books with her wherever she went? Asked Miriam. She's the one. Her books were always incredibly large, and she always had more than one. Good memory. I think she was a history major. No, said Helen with a shake of her head. She was a French major. I remember how she was always playing the piano and singing French songs. We teased her that she only sang in French. Well, said Susan, we may be able to ask her because she's coming to Boston. Would it be possible for her to stay with us one night? In her letters, she says that she's heading to Paris. She and some other girls were hired by the U.S. Army Signal Corps. She says she'll explain it all when she sees us. Certainly she can stay here, Deborah said. She graduated with us, didn't she? Helen asked. Yes, and since graduation, she's been a telephone operator, said Susan. Miriam joined the discussion. That seems like such an interesting job. I don't think I could keep track of who was calling whom, and I would be afraid I'd plug people into the wrong calls. But I think I'd enjoy listening in on everyone's conversations. I bet you would, said Deborah, smirking. Once it was arranged, Susan and Helen talked about Grace, remembering her as a cheerful person. Susan, who knew her best, said, even though she lived off campus, she was very involved in many campus activities, and sometimes she stayed in our dormitory with her friend Suzanne. Remember the awful time we went to see her in that drama club production about a mayor or something? And this is actually a picture of Barnard College Theater in 1909.
Wow.
I remember she played a judge. It was a stupid farce and a musical. Helen raised her eyebrows as she said this. And she was on the Barnard baseball team, Deborah said. We went with you once to watch her. I wasn't at all interested, but I rooted her on with the rest of you. And I remember her being very religious, said Helen. I hope she doesn't talk a great deal about church and God. That won't bother us, said Miriam. We talk a lot about being Jewish, so we should be tolerant of her beliefs. Do we bother you with our religious focus? Not at all, said Susan. And I'm going to stop for a minute to tell you that the Judaica on the right side of that picture were from the original Temple Mishkan Tefillah, which is where Deborah and Miriam go to temple. The new Temple Mishkan Tefillah has the old relics. So these are actually from Deborah and Miriam's time, from the right temple. 2 weeks later, Deborah and Susan picked up Grace at Boston's South Station. She was tired, having taken a train from her family's home in Passaic, New Jersey, over 200 miles away, but her senses woke up as they drove her around Boston, showing her the sights. Grace immediately liked the city, comparing it favorably to New York City, where she had gone to school with Susan and Helen. Arriving at their home on Homestead Street in the Roxbury section of the city, she was greeted with warm hugs by Helen. It was not long before they were all sitting in the living room sharing memories. Grace laughed loudly when they reminded her of her heavy history books and her French songs. She explained she had a double major, so they were both correct. Thank you so much for letting me stay here, said Grace. My cousin lives in Boston, and I want to see her before I go overseas. We're glad to have a chance to see you and catch up, said Helen. Tell us what you've been doing since you graduated, Grace. It took me a while to find a job, but then I found an advertisement for a position as a telephone operator. Well, actually a trainer for long-distance calls. Once I was on the job, I felt satisfied, even though it didn't use my knowledge of history or French. At least I had a position I was skilled at and some money coming in. It was a good job for a girl with a college degree. Tell us what it's like, said Miriam, fascinated with this. It's interesting work, at least better than a factory job. There are at least 25 girls working on our switchboard. We were given diction and elocution lessons and told to be polite to everyone, no matter how rude they were. What kind of girls are on your switchboard? Asked Deborah, suddenly interested. All unmarried girls, of course, and no one who had an accent, and we all had to be a certain height in order to reach the switchboard. I would never have thought of that, said Helen, obviously interested too. They chatted about her work, Susan asking about the job she was heading for in France. Although I liked my job at the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which we called AT&T, after 3 years I was getting restless. I saw an advertisement in the New York Globe in December for telephone operators in France. I thought it would be a fabulous opportunity to use my French and my telephone skills, so I sent them a letter. I got impatient when I did not hear back from them, so I sent a second letter telling them I spoke French and English and I was thoroughly trained in telephony, the exact requirements of the job. Finally, I got an answer and they said they wanted to hire me to work for the Army. I was thrilled. What will you be doing? Asked Miriam. I really don't know details, said Grace, except that I know I'll be reporting for duty just a week from now. And this is actually one of the communications systems that was used actually near the front lines. You'll learn more about it, but that was what they were like. Doesn't look like AT&T switchboards. I think we're here to help with communication between the front lines and headquarters. I don't know if they'll train us on board or whether we'll be trained to reach when we reach our destination. It's all very mysterious. We don't even know when we're leaving or where in France we're going. I'm envious that you get to travel to Europe, but I wouldn't want to go during wartime, said Deborah. Do you think they'll keep you out of harm's way? I certainly hope so, though I'm actually scared. I wanted an adventure, but I had not planned to have one in the middle of a war. You need to keep us informed about what it's like when you get to France, said Susan. Now you have us all interested and concerned. I'll be happy to correspond with you. I suspect I'll have lots of time to write letters. Ah, silly. Susan and Helen. Grace asked Susan and Helen how their lives had changed since they graduated from Barnard College and how they were managing in Boston. Susan and Helen had previously explained the basics in letters, that they were now a couple, and they moved to Boston after the wonderful opera by Deborah and Miriam, so they could be together. They talked of their jobs at Deborah and Miriam's publishing and printing shop, and their joy to be employed and to be together. Grace wondered if they found working at this shop frustrating as a mismatch for their education and their goals, noting the parallel to her own history. She too had taken an adequate job that did not fit her expectations, and her thrill to use her new skills in this new position. She would save that question for later. So the reason I have this up, this is Mrs. Stern, because the five of them talked until they were called to dinner by Mrs. Stern, their cook. When you see Mrs. Stern in the book, that's my Grandma Levy. So that's my Bobby, yeah. That's the only reason I put it up there, so you get to meet my grandma.
I see the resemblance.
Yeah. Dinner conversation was mostly about the job Grace was about to take. She was pleased to be in the Army and to wear a uniform. The rest of their time together was pleasant. All four girls were thrilled that Grace would write to them to tell them her adventures overseas. They all looked forward to experiencing her life vicariously. On April 8th, Susan and Helen received their first letter from their friend Grace. As they both read it, they shared it with Deborah and Miriam, who were anxious to hear about her adventures. March 22nd, 1918. Dear Susan and Helen, I've been aboard a ship for several days and I'm already overwhelmed. There are 32 women headed to work the switchboards with me in the Signal Corps Female Telephone Operators Unit. I don't understand why, but I've been chosen to lead the team. Although I'm honored I was offered this position, it's separated me from the companionship the other girls have with one another. Because I'm their supervisor, even though I'm just 25 years old, they treat me differently. I find I'm left out of the normal banter between the girls, though I'm very fond of them. We've just learned a bit about the job, but I can't tell you any information. They censor our letters. Yours truly, Grace. April 1st, 1918. I'm continuing the same letter because I wasn't able to mail the first part of this letter due to some perilous times we faced. We arrived in England and were to set sail through the English Channel on a small ship when a thick fog prevented our travel. We were stuck for over 3 days in the Channel, making us an easy target for German bombings. We stayed on deck for 2 full days at full readiness to evacuate the boat on short notice. The girls were strong and a great team. I'm proud to be part of this group, though we were quite shaken by our ordeal. I've recently gotten word the ship that brought us to France struck a mine and 17 people on board were killed. The ship survived and several passengers were rescued. It's frightening to think this could have been us. Tomorrow we head to our next location, which will be too close to the fighting for us to feel safe. We'll be facilitating communications between the troops on the front line and those officers at headquarters who will plan the next moves. It's wonderful to have such an important role in this war, though I had no idea when I signed up for this job that I'd be putting my life at risk on a regular basis. I'll write again when I'm able. Yours truly, Grace. And in the book, there are many more letters and private details, so you have to read the book to get much more information. But here is a short video, and I hope I enabled it so we can see it. If not, I will. This is a video.
Is that Grace?
Yep, hold on, it is Grace. I'm gonna end it for a second. Let's try again. Here we go.
Grace Banker is an American war hero you have probably never heard of. At the age of 25, this Passaic, New Jersey native led America's first female soldiers overseas in World War I. They were popularly known as Hello Girls, and they provided vital communications, including dangerous frontline combat support in France. But when they returned home to the United States, more than 200 Hello Girls, including their leader, Grace Banker, were denied recognition as veterans because of Army regulations.
After the war, they kind of thought the women, well, you know, you got paid, right? You wore the uniform, it was a great adventure, but you weren't really in the Army. Yes, we were. And that's why it took so long, is they were up against the Army policy at the time was that only men could serve.
Grace Banker's granddaughter joined military and veteran representatives in a moving ceremony at Greenwood Cemetery. 64 years after Banker's death in 1960, a special memorial was dedicated at her gravesite. It included a veteran medallion, a distinction only available to those who have served in the military.
This is an amazing experience for me and my family, recognizing my grandmother, who, along with the other Hello Girls, her story was lost and forgotten over time. All of the things that we have today could come back down to those few women.
In the last decade, the Hello Girls are finally getting recognition for risking their lives to help end World War I. A documentary made about their unrecognized heroism. And the Hello Girls, a new American musical featuring one of the stars singing a song called Making History at Banker's gravesite. There's been a years-long campaign to get a Congressional Gold Medal honoring the World War I female telephone operators known as the Hello Girls. And now finally, after decades and decades of this campaign, it looks like it's about to happen.
Less than 200 people have ever gotten that medal. George Washington was the first. So they're in some very elite company.
She was a leader, and she did it because she felt it was the right thing to do for her country.
And now her country feels it's the right thing to do to acknowledge her service.
So now you get a little, isn't that fun? You get a little taste of how much fun it is to take real history and bring it into my characters. So now we're moving on. We're going to move to another section of the book, the one about the military experience for women in the early 1900s. And this is about Fanny, who's pictured on the left, who is the oldest daughter of the Berkowitz family, the best friends of Deborah's parents. This girl was a challenging adolescent, and now at 17, she takes on a new adventure. And pay close attention to Rena, because I'm going to, because you'll want to know about her. Yeoman F. Fanny Berkowitz was sworn into the United States Navy on June 29, 1918. Fanny was very proud that she would be making the same pay as her male counterparts, $28.75 per month. And she would have the same benefits and responsibilities as the men. Though she hoped to be sent overseas, she quickly learned that most of the 12,000 women enlisted were kept stateside. It was mostly nurses who were sent abroad, and the hello girls. She was told that it was probable that she would be stationed at a naval base in the U.S., taking the role of a man who had been shipped to Europe. Her fellow recruits were hoping to be assigned to positions such as truck drivers, mechanics, or radio operators. Fanny held a romanticized image of being a strong, independent woman with a responsible position, but her fate was unclear. As a new draftee, Fanny was packed into a crowded train heading to Pelham Bay, New York. Many of her fellow inductees came down with the influenza just days after arriving at their training camp. Fanny avoided catching the disease and was soon on her way to her post at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Fanny looked at the huge complex of buildings and momentarily thought she had made a bad mistake. She had never been anywhere on her own except to travel to Boston to visit Deborah and Miriam, and now she needed to navigate this whole new world. She followed the other girls, got assigned a bunk, clothing, and supplies, and then headed for her dreaded haircut. She feared they would make her look like a boy, but they trimmed her locks just above her shoulder in a style that she actually found becoming. Assigned to her bunk next to her was a slight girl who introduced herself as Rena. And this is Anna Mae's mother. This is a picture I got from her. And Fanny was pleased to find another Jew. The two of them had been equally nervous and were glad to have a kindred soul with whom to talk. By the end of the first day, Fanny had a friend. The day after her arrival, Fanny and the others reported to the factory, a massive building filled with planes and half-built planes. Fanny was tremendously disappointed when she received her new role, secretary. This factory was well known for giving female enlistees the jobs previously held by men, and she was frustrated she'd be stuck in the traditional female clerical role. She was given a desk and a quiet office, and she looked longingly at the women assigned to learning manufacturing equipment or driving trucks. Rena was to test equipment, a much more appealing job. Back in their bunks after a dinner of hardly digestible food, she and Rena talked of their jobs. Being in the Navy, both thought they would be aboard a ship rather than participating in the construction of aircraft. It was all frustrating. They soon learned that the Navy was very proud of this new facility, which had been built the year before to supply small planes. They were mostly constructing end-to-ends, a small biplane. Some were equipped with twin floats. The closest it seemed the girls would get to anything related to the water. So much for choosing the Navy over the Army. January 16th, 1918, dear Deborah and Miriam. I'm a Yeoman F. That's what they call us girls who join the Navy. My bunkmate Rena and I are adjusting quite well. I was really disappointed when I got assigned to be a secretary, but Rena tells me it's a fine job. She is working on a much more interesting post, testing equipment. She said that she'll ask her commanding officer if I could come work with her, but we doubt they'll listen to her. Rena and I are totally disgusted with the food. We have to eat or we get in trouble. They call it demerits. But I don't look forward to meals. But I must tell you, I like my new haircut. Rena says it's cute. She looks adorable in her haircut too, but the uniforms were awful. They're pretty shapeless, probably so the men won't notice us. But next week we get our dress uniforms, and I bet we look really nice in those. Rena has a cousin in the Army who loves to get dressed in her dress uniform, and I'm hoping we feel the same way. I will send you a photograph if I ever get a hold of a camera. Have you talked with my mother and father? How are they? How are my sisters managing without me? I bet Ethel already moved into my room and is enjoying being the oldest sister now. I need to go now. Rena is waiting for me to take a walk. Please write. It's really exciting to get letters here. They call out your name and you get to go forward out of the line to pick up your mail. Love, Fanny. Deborah looked at Miriam once she was done reading the letter and said, well, we know more about Rena than about anything else. I noticed. Deborah and Miriam took turns writing to Fanny, making certain that she got at least one letter each week. They also felt it important to check in with Mrs. Berkowitz, who quite regularly dropped a few tears during their conversations. They agreed that parenting a teenager was sometimes more difficult than caring for a young child. Dear Deborah and Miriam, January 28th, 1918. I have exciting news. My assignment was changed. I don't think it was because I was doing a poor job as a secretary, nor did they listen to Rena's suggestion that I work with her. It was more because a girl working with the biplanes got the influenza and had to be replaced. I'm not sure if she died. I thank the officer who gave me my new job, but I don't think she cared whether I was pleased or not. They just see it as a job. Although I won't be working with Rena, I'll be on the floor with her instead of in the office. Now it'll be easier to go to lunch together instead of having to plan a place to meet. Once I start my new job, I'll let you know what I'm doing. Love, Fanny. Miriam turned to Deborah and asked, I wondered if I talked about you this much when I was falling in love with you. I assume you did. So Miriam said, do you think Fanny could be like us? Time will tell. And when you read the book, you're going to learn lots more about Fanny and Rena. They go on for a long time. And I will tell you a secret. I am considering when I'm done with the next book, which is the last in the series, I'm going to give Fanny and Rena a sequel. Okay, so now here's another section, very short section. This book contains really interesting stories about things you probably never heard about. And here's one of my favorites. There are lots of these little silly things. Deborah and Miriam's friends arrived with a special treat. Recent visitors of theirs bought them a large box of chocolate cupcakes from Taggart Bakery of Indianapolis, Indiana, which they wished to share. Miriam looked at them with substantial concern, assuming they were not kosher. Maybe they were made with lard, rendered pork fat, or even if they used beef fat, it would not be kosher. Never before had non-kosher food entered their home, so Miriam was shaken. When Miriam disappeared into the kitchen, Deborah followed her, noting Miriam's pale complexion. What's wrong? Those cakes are probably not kosher. I don't want to reject that kind offer, but I can't serve them. What should I do? Everyone could hold them on their napkins so they don't touch our plates. But I don't want the girls to have them. When Deborah and Miriam did not return right away, Susan joined them in the kitchen to find out what the problem was. When Deborah explained the situation, Susan said she'd take care of everything. Deborah and Miriam were awkward with their guests when they returned, yet the cakes were missing and the discussion went on. After a lovely visit, Susan and Helen walked the visitors out the door. Deborah suspected they were all eating cakes out on the porch, but said nothing to Miriam, who was too busy washing teacups to notice the group was gone for a while. But now here's the fun part. This is the footnote that gives you some of the backstory. The small chocolate cakes from Taggart's Bakery were hugely popular in Indiana. In 1921, Taggart's introduced a second popular product, which soon became the most popular bread in the United States, called Wonder Bread. When Continental Baking Company bought Taggart's in 1925, they made the chocolate cupcakes a commercial success, eventually renaming them Hostess Cupcakes. Later, Continental produced another product, Twinkies. And these products were made with beef fat and were not kosher. So before I finish, are you ready for some sex?
Oh, Twister.
If you don't want to listen, leave now. Here's a little sampling of the intimate relationship between Deborah and Miriam. They're young and in love, so their physical connection is just part of their story. And what you'll notice if you read the first book is it's got lots of sex, and as it goes on, they have less, because we all know that as you've been together longer, it's less. So the first one is the hottest. July 4th, 1918. As she came down to breakfast, Miriam asked Deborah, "What are we going to do this evening during Boston's celebrations for July 4th? Last year, when our little girl Sylvia was only 4 years old, she got really scared with the extreme noise. I have no idea how to protect her from hearing it tonight because we live so close to where the fireworks will be set off." The fireworks happen every year, so she'll just have to get used to it, Deborah said. What an insensitive answer. You're right, I'm sorry. I was deeply engrossed in a story in the newspaper, yet that gives me no right to treat you like that. I'll put the paper aside to discuss this with you. If you read the book, you'll find out what the article was she was reading, because it was significant. Miriam reminded Deborah that Massachusetts was one of the first states to recognize July 4th as a holiday and one of the first to incorporate fireworks in their celebration. She took a deep gulp of air, assuming there was little to do to keep Sylvia out of earshot of the explosive noise. With no obvious solution, she turned the discussion back to the newspaper article Deborah was reading. Just then, their childminder Rachel arrived, offering to take Sylvia for the evening. As usual, she was sensitive to our child's needs and promised to keep her away from the noisy fireworks. After sending them on their adventure, Deborah and Miriam took advantage of the rare experience of having an evening alone to themselves. They decided to forego the festivities in the city in favor of uninterrupted time together. They shyly wished Susan and Helen a nice evening, embarrassed their plans might be obvious. Immediately after their friends left, Deborah pulled Miriam into a tight embrace. Their kisses soon became passionate, and before they realized it, they were both sweaty and moist. "I'd like some loving right here in the parlor," Deborah whispered.
Ooh.
"Deborah!" Miriam giggled as she pulled her dress down from her shoulders, exposing her breasts. She looked around as if some stranger might be looking at them, though she was soon caught in the passion Deborah was already feeling. They lay on the long couch, barely fitting their two bodies onto the narrow width. Gradually, they peeled off their clothing until they were naked right in the middle of the living space. Neither had ever imagined being in such a position, which added excitement. Deborah rolled off the divan and positioned herself between Miriam's legs, facing the beautiful sight of Miriam's nakedness. They'd not taken off the time to turn off the lights, so she had full view of the intimacy in front of her. Just a few licks of Miriam's privacy. You should try to find a picture that's the only picture other than this that I could find that looked at all appropriate had a woman giving birth, and I tried to find out the baby, but it didn't do it. So this is what you get. With just a few licks of Miriam's privacy, they were fully engaged and loving. Their excitement of the forbidden love in the parlor fueled their passion. The sound of fireworks crackling in the near distance added to the thrill of the evening. And you need to read the book to hear the climax. Of the story. And for my writing group, I did the same story, and I made them write a sex scene. That was really fun. Aren't you glad I didn't require that of you? So you've now heard a few short excerpts from the book Victory Virus Votes 1917 to 1920, and there are more details about each of the sections that I read, as well as many other stories. And this was really an important time in American history, and it's likely that you're going to learn lots of new information. And even if you had some previous knowledge about some of the events, you may have new insights as you experience these events in a very personal way through the characters. And this is the power of historical fiction. It really helps history to come alive. Okay, because you've been a good audience and you've been quiet, I will go on and give you a little preview of the next book, Born Lesbian, Deborah's memoir. This book has one chapter for each year of Deborah's life. This excerpt is taken from one of my own experiences. I was on the last plane to land at JFK Airport during the blackout of 1965. And this excerpt is from the perspective of those on the ground waiting for the plane to land. On Tuesday, November 9th, my sister Anna and I approached John F. Kennedy International Airport, where Anna's sweet boyfriend Nathan would soon be returning from a conference in London. Suddenly, as we approached the arrival gate, the lights went out, drenching the entire airport in blackness. There was not a flicker of light, not even outside on the runway. After a moment of complete silence, we heard small whispered voices, and then a cacophony of sound as people searched for their companions. I grabbed Anna and we groped until we found each other's hand. We stood still, connected. Suddenly, there were flashes of light as airport personnel found the flashlights which must have been positioned at each desk, and emergency lights flicked on, lighting the main hallway. Loud, strong voices welcomed us to follow the lights the final few steps towards the arrival gate. A booming voice announced that Flight 607 from Heathrow Airport would be landing shortly. We joined in a collective gasp as awaiting family and friends mentally reviewed the risks of a plane landing in complete darkness. Just then, a row of emergency lights lit up outside, and we sighed, hoping these lights would guide the plane down. We all headed to the window with our heads turned toward the sound of an airplane approaching the landing strip. We held our breaths as a huge monster emerged from the skies, dropping to the ground with ease as if in daylight. Loud applause and whoops of relief surrounded us as the same voice announced the safe arrival of Flight 607. This was the last plane to arrive following the blackout, which had been too close to landing to be diverted back into the air. We were told to wait at the gate for the passengers to disembark, and we waited behind an imaginary line until we saw the passengers we were waiting for. We watched as passenger after passenger was escorted through the gate with a beam of light shining on each of them as they emerged. Anna practically ran to Nathan when she spotted him, with their embrace shortened by someone whisking us through the dark corridor to a makeshift baggage claim area. There was no careful inspection of his bags, as was standard after an international flight. An airport employee with a flashlight matched Nathan's bag tag to his receipt, and we were told to exit the airport as quickly as possible. The three of us huddled together until an airport employee directed us to the door. Finding our car among all the others under the dark sky was challenging. Once inside Anna's car, everyone other than Nathan breathed a sigh of relief. His shoulders were huddled near his ears as he shared his experience while watching out the plane window during the descent. He told us that there was suddenly total darkness, not only at the airport, but everywhere. All of New York abruptly went dark. During the next seconds, he imagined several scenarios which have caused the city of New York to be obliterated. Nathan heard everyone on the plane take in deep breaths, obviously fearing for their lives as he did as the plane descended into the dark night. Nathan felt relief when the emergency runway lights glowed bright, yet he was still unsure if they could land safely. The next few minutes felt endless. When the wheels gently hit the ground, a round of clapping and yelps spontaneously filled the plane. There was emotion in the sound of the stewardess who announced, "Welcome to JFK International Airport." After waiting for a while, hoping the lights would return, we eventually headed out of the airport. We only had our own lights and those of the cars in front of us to guide us. When we arrived at Anna and Nathan's building, Nathan said shakily, "I may never fly again." We all smiled. Okay, now it's time for the hard sell. Please buy my books. Not quite. I want you to buy my books. Artists need your support so we can continue our creative work. My books are for sale in the back and also on Amazon.com. and I hope you enjoyed the stories you've heard. First, you heard about Grace Banker and the Hologram. Hold on, I want to remind you, the last group only remembered the last story I told them. I don't want you to only remember that. You also learned about Grace Banker, the Hello Girls, then you heard about Fanny Berkowitz joining the Navy and being assigned to the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she met her adorable bunkmate, Rena. Then you heard the history of Hostess Cupcakes, and finally you got a sneak preview into my next book and learned about my experience being on the last plane to land at JFK Airport during the blackout of 1965. So if you're interested in learning the backstory of any of these historical events or about my characters, follow me on Facebook on Ellen M. Levy, author. I am now going through every chapter, one chapter at a time, and giving you backstories. So you get to hear a little bit more about the history and a little bit more about how the characters reacted. So it's really fun to read that if you're reading the new book. And now I'm ready for any questions you have, or about Victory Virus votes, about my writing, about my research, about anything.
About your hair?
So, questions? Yes?
Can you say more about the blackout of 65? I'm not remembering that.
Yeah, I was on the plane when the entire city of New York went black. It was really scary. It was
But you were so
electrical.
young, how do you remember?
What caused this?
It was some electrical failure, and the whole New England all went black.
I don't remember it.
How did that blackout story relate to?
Folks, I can't hear the question.
How did that blackout story relate to Dorothy and Miriam?
So,
Deborah.
Deborah and Miriam, so I had it relate to them going to the airport to pick up, Anna, pick up her boyfriend.
Oh,
And so
okay.
Anna's throughout it, and you meet Anna and Nathan earlier, so that's the way I got you into that story. So each time there was a historical event, I had to find a way for my characters to get connected, like having Fanny go into the military and meeting with meeting Rena. And, you know, it really takes a while to figure out how to make it relate to the characters. Sometimes I just sit there for a couple of days and try to imagine how is this gonna fit with my characters? Eventually I come up with something. Yes.
Can you discuss the origin of the term Boston marriage?
So Boston Marriage actually came from a book by James Joyce, who wrote a book about Henry James, I said the wrong thing. Henry James, who wrote a book about a woman who, she and her friend were both attracted to the same man, and they ended up in a relationship. Boston Marriage was never used in the book. They didn't use the term, but it must have been in Boston, because the term Boston Marriage came from that, and it was written about his sister Alice, who was in a Boston marriage.
So it's not necessarily a lesbian relationship, or is it?
There's no way to know. The assumption is that Boston marriages were sexual, but nobody has any way to prove it. I mean, my grandmother lived with another woman, so in effect, she lived in a Boston marriage, but I'm sure there was no sex going on.
How do you know?
At least
I don't think that should necessarily be the indication anyway, because even, our right to love defines a lesbian as someone whose primary emotional or psychological or sexual attraction is towards another woman. So I think a Boston marriage, if it's between two women who are sharing time and life, then it's a relationship. It doesn't matter whether it's
And
sexual or not.
the second book is called Struggles in a Boston Marriage.
Yeah.
Other questions,
Thank you
comments?
very much.
Yes.
When an author like you is selling books, do you benefit most by the audience going through Amazon or by buying something here?
Buying it here is better. I get them at a slightly, let me tell you, I don't make a whole lot of money either way, but I make a little bit more if I sell them to you myself. So I'd rather you buy them here. And there's a special, if you buy the new book and you want an old version, I have some with an older cover before I had my publishing company, before I was working with a publishing company, so you can get it a little cheaper. And if you buy them all, there's a discount, $10 off. Other questions?
how do you pick the events of the time period to fit into your story? Like, you've dovetailed so much of what was happening in 1918 into your story of these women. How did you decide which things to put in there and what years to focus on?
Sometimes it's just sitting there for several days figuring out whether it will fit. Is there a way to make a real connection, or am I just doing something artificial? Does it really feel like something that one of them would be reacting to? And it's been interesting because as I go through this period, I've had to learn things I didn't necessarily want to know, because the next book covers up till 1964, so I have several chapters on the Holocaust. And I didn't want it to be a negative book. I didn't want it to be just painful, so it's about heroines and heroes of the Holocaust mostly. Other questions? Yes?
How is this book received in your Jewish community? Is lesbianism caught up as I'm coming from a Christian background, of course, I'm mired in guilt, but.
No, we have the market on guilt, you have
When
shame.
you present to your Jewish audiences, how is it received?
So the Jewish audiences I presented to are mostly like-minded people. I haven't, I found that when I tried presenting to facilities here in Florida, I had more of a problem because they were lesbians than I had with Jewish audiences in Boston.
Right.
Here, they didn't want anything to do with a lesbian book. I couldn't get into any speaking engagements practically.
Oh, that sucks. Carefree, your work is cut out for you.
Any, Carol Ann?
Have you gotten any hate mail or criticism?
Never,
Oh, good.
not one single piece. I'm very fortunate. Okay, well,
Thank you,
please
Ellen.
eat lots of food. I'm a Jewish mother, I have too much food, so please take food. You can take some home, I have some plastic bags if you'd like to take some home with you. Thank you.
Jewish mothers don't